Welcome to Unravel by UniHawk. My name is Javeed Riaz. I am the Director of Test Preparation and Exam Preparation at UniHawk. Today I have with me Saksham, who is one of our top SAT scorers. He took the test on August 26th, and I will let him speak about himself in more details.
Hello there, I am Saksham Agarwal. I go to JSSIS. I'm in 11th grade. I took the test last month, got my results last week. Did pretty well, I think.
And what did you score?
I scored a 1520.
Great. Now we'll come to how you feel about that score in some time, but for those of our listeners who don't know what the SAT is all about, it is a college entrance test, and it has two sections on it. There is a reading and writing section, and there is a math section on the test. And the test overall takes about 2 hours and 15 minutes. Actually 2 hours and 24 minutes if I count a 10 minutes break as well. Quite challenging, but I want to know what is your take on the SAT overall? Do you think it is a challenging test?
Yeah, I think it's a challenging test, but not exactly for the reasons that you just mentioned. For me, the biggest challenge of the SAT was the fact that it happened at like 8 o'clock in the morning. And this was at the end of my vacation, so I was like used to waking up at like 12. So it was like quite challenging to wake up much earlier. I had to start building the routine like a week earlier. I still wasn't able to build it properly by then.
I see. So your challenge was waking up. Okay, well, that's an easier kind of challenge to fix. Great. Saksham, I want to hear the journey to a 1520. Now, I remember the very first day that you showed up to one of my demo classes. In fact, we started off in this classroom itself.
Yeah.
And at the time, reading and writing section was one of your fears.
Yeah.
But then you ended up bringing your reading and writing score at par with your math score. So tell me what it takes to score 1520 on the SAT.
It's just a lot of practice. Your advice obviously helped a lot.
Thank you.
Like the specific techniques you told, like the process of elimination and the methods used for the getting the correct answer in all the questions, especially the questions that I struggled with, like the paragraphs. I wouldn't exactly know what kind of question they were asking. I would be able to understand the question properly. But then, like through a lot of practice, I took about I think 25 practice tests in total. The wouldn't really expect it, but like some practice tests are horrible. I feel like the ones I took towards the end actually made me worse at the SAT.
Mhm.
I don't know the company they were printed by, but
Mhm.
the English used in those was just very bad.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. One of the main challenges this year we have with the SAT is having the right material for our students. I struggled a lot at the beginning of the year, but luckily I was with the right team at UniHawk to procure the right material for our students, and that is why we had such an amazing August 26th. You must have seen our social media ads, and I was absolutely thrilled. Now, a lot of people think that crossing the 1500 points on the SAT is near impossible. And as much as I tell them it has to do with how much practice you do and how much time you dedicate to your SAT, they still think that, it's such a big deal. I mean, it is a big deal, but tell me about some of the sacrifices you had to make during your summer holidays for the SAT in order to obtain a score of 1520.
I like about a month before the SAT, I pretty much stopped going out. I mean, I would go out for like dinner sometimes, but like I didn't really go out that much.
Mm-hmm.
Before I used to like spend half the day outside just roaming around, but like that ended very quickly. I feel like it took a lot of practice tests. I just spent like a few hours reading the books, Barron's and Princeton Review. I mostly read the Princeton Review. Barron's I use for the practice tests. I feel like the practice tests in Barron's are much easier than the ones in Princeton Review and of UniHawk.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say I didn't really sacrifice that much.
Hmm.
But like it obviously took like a lot of time in preparation.
Right, right. Perhaps that is the biggest sacrifice that one has to make in order to cross 1,500 points on the SAT. Time, right? You have to dedicate time. Uh, we have so many students who have good stories to tell about how they crammed everything a night before an exam at school and ended up getting an A star or a 7 in IB curriculum. Do you think you can cram everything overnight for the SAT?
No. SAT is not really about the theory, it's more about the practice because you don't really know what's going to come in the test.
Mm-hmm.
No matter how much you cram the night before, you aren't going to get like enough practice. If you're like not thinking in maths, you can't really do the math section level.
Mm-hmm.
The maths section of the SAT was like way harder than I thought it would be.
Mm-hmm.
I did think it was going to be pretty easy though. That's why. It wasn't hard, just harder than I thought it would be.
I see. There is a fundamental difference between the SAT math and the math that you do at school. SAT math really wants to see how much you can utilize basic mathematical concepts in solving problems. And that's why every time the problem looks slightly different than the other problems you practiced on. But then essentially it boils down to, can you translate the ideas that you have into mathematical equations and then solve that linear equation? If you do that, if you manage to do the translation correctly, then you're there. I don't think it's that difficult of a problem. Let's talk about the reading and writing section. Now, in this part of the world, reading and writing section is a bigger problem or a bigger challenge for many students. I've had students from the States, and for them, reading and writing is not as hard. They often struggle with math. But then in this part of the world, reading, writing is quite challenging. I want to hear from you. What was the most challenging question type you had on the test?
In terms of question type, I'd say it's more of a tie between vocabulary questions and comparison questions. Comparison questions being the type of questions where they give you two pieces of text, you need to compare between the two. Like, what is the second author's view on the first author?
Mm-hmm.
I just found that incredibly confusing because I thought it was mostly up to like speculation.
Mm-hmm.
Also, vocabulary questions, like mostly they would be easy, but in the second section, if you did very well on the first section, they could just sneak in like a really hard vocabulary question with 3 words you've never heard of.
Yeah. Now you're absolutely right. And you pointed out how adaptive the test is, right? So if you do very well on the first module, which you absolutely should, then in the second module, you will face some really challenging questions across the board. And in the context of vocabulary questions, yes, they will sneak in, as you said, a couple of words that you have never heard of, right? And that's a difficult position to be in, right? Because you can't do anything about it. It's not like reasoning your way out of it. Context clues may or may not help there, right? Okay, so how did you train yourself for the vocabulary questions?
The only training I see for the vocabulary questions is to do a lot of the passage questions because the passage questions use the vocabulary that is used in the vocabulary questions.
Mm-hmm.
So if you practice a lot of the questions given, they give passages and you need to find out the summary of the passage or fill in the blanks. You read the passage most of the time in these passage questions, although sometimes you don't in the other types of passage questions.
Mm-hmm.
But the vocabulary will be used as like natural environment in these passage questions. So if you practice more and more of them, you get pretty good vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
And since they use mostly the vocabulary from these questions in the vocabulary section, you get pretty good at it. But
Okay.
past a certain point, it doesn't work anymore.
So correct me if I'm wrong. You're saying when you do other reading types of questions, for example, you have a text, you have to read that text to answer the question, obviously. And if you run into an unknown word, that's the word that you jot down and memorize because you think that word may show up in the vocabulary section, right?
Yes.
That's definitely one way to improve your vocabulary. And what did you dislike most about the reading and writing section?
I didn't like the rhetorical synthesis questions.
But they're the easy ones, aren't they?
They're usually easy, but like if you have a hard rhetorical synthesis question, it's really confusing to solve it. Because you spend most of it more time in that question than any other type of question in my experience. Because except in the real SAT, they have like 7 rhetorical synthesis questions and all really easy. But like the diagnostic mock test, it's more like only 2 rhetorical synthesis questions, and both of them are really hard. Not hard, just complicated. You have to read the passage a bunch of times to understand what we're talking about, really.
Right, it can be a little lengthy, but that is generally an easier type of question on the SAT. Let's move on and talk about the math section of the test. Now, I'm sure you find that section a lot more comfortable, even though your scores equaled by the time you went to the real test. But what was the most challenging type of question on the math test for you?
I wouldn't really say any of them are that challenging. I guess in some questions you can't really input the value into Desmos and get the answer. So you have to actually work those out yourself.
Yeah. And I thank God that you can't just rely on Desmos, otherwise I would be out of job as a math tutor. I remember when you finished your test, I was driving to my class and you told me about the question that you struggled with, right?
Yeah, there were 2 questions I just couldn't solve them because I don't know why. When I was taking a question, I had full tunnel vision. I'd finished all the other questions in the section. So I went back to them. I couldn't think of anything to solve them.
Yeah.
I went home and I realized on the card I just solved them. It was really simple.
Yeah. No, I was quite shocked when you told me that this was one of the challenging questions for you, because you sent me a voice message, and as soon as I stopped my car, I took out my iPad and I wrote down the question. And I was furious at you that day, because the Saksham that I know would have solved that question with his eyes closed. But I think when you're in the game and the clock is ticking, sometimes you don't see the simplest steps ahead of you, right? But it doesn't mean you don't know the question, as you went home and you solved it yourself, right?
Yeah, in like 5 minutes. Also, my dad also solved it. Even for him, it was really easy.
That's right. And I don't think your dad is currently preparing for the SAT, right? No. Yes. So it is the fact that you're under a lot of time pressure and your brain is not braining at times, right? Is that the right lingo?
Yeah. Especially since you have to wake up so early.
Yeah, and that was a new thing for you. Well, that's probably one reason why students should take the SAT during their summer holidays, but another attempt in October, maybe. Which brings me to my next question. Will you consider retaking the test?
Yeah, definitely.
You already have a 15-20. So if you're retaking it, why? I know I advised your dad to tell you to retake it, but I want to hear from you. Why do you want to retake it?
I feel like I really flopped the math section because I wasn't used to waking up early, or because the pressure of time, I guess. So I really want to retake the SAT and get like a better score on maths, because some colleges will take the super score, like the best you've ever gotten in maths, best you've gotten in reading and writing. I'd say the reading and writing section went surprisingly well for me. I didn't expect to get a 760, but the math section I really flopped it.
Yeah, so you're not happy with a 760 in your math section.
Yeah.
That's great. That's actually many of UniHawk's students. If you were in India when we had our test fiesta event in our DIFC office, one of the students who came to take the test was a student who took the test before and got a 1550. And the target we had for him was 1580, which is why he reattempted August 26th and ended up getting a higher math score. His plan is exactly what you described, super scoring. So he's going to super score, and that will push his score higher up. And a lot of universities are open to super score SAT scores across 2 different tests. My next question is, what set of tips and tricks would you like to recommend to your peers to boost their scores like you did?
Actually, one of these I came across while doing the SAT. there was a passage about this thing called the Pomodoro method, in which you study for 25 minutes and take a break for 5 minutes, and after like 4 of those you take a longer break.
Yeah.
And while doing it, I discovered that and I started using that to practice for the SAT, and it worked really well.
Okay. So you're saying practice 25 minutes a set of SAT questions,
Yeah.
then give yourself 5 minutes break,
Yeah.
then practice another 25 minutes, and then give yourself a slightly longer break. Is that?
You take like 3 or 4 of these 5 minutes.
Yeah.
You get 2 hours maybe, and then take like a 30-minute break.
I see. Okay. Yeah, because over time you may need a longer rest,
Yeah.
right? So it would be very effective. Great. Now let's be a bit more specific. Reading type of question. Reading itself is quite challenging, right? If you remember grammar part, punctuation, we talked about simple rules that could easily fix the grammar, the punctuation questions, right? But for reading, many students struggle there. What's your advice for reading questions?
The reading questions, for myself especially, I feel like if I'm reading the passage, I'm not actually reading it most of the time. I'm just looking over the words and going in one ear out the other, not actually paying attention to what it's being said, like the larger thing. So I feel like for the reading questions, if you struggle with the same problem, you should try reading the question 3-4 times, 2 to 3 times, not 4 times. It's too much. You'll lose time. Read the question first, obviously, and look for that for a specific vocabulary that's used in the question in the passage, or like synonyms for that same vocabulary. Or it's like a summary, just don't look at the words individually or the sentences individually, just try to connect them all to like a larger picture.
That's the synthesis lesson that we talked about. Now I want to quiz you and see how much do you still remember from my classes. What is the single most important step in answering the reading questions?
Reading the question, process of elimination.
These are steps, but the single most important step.
Framing your own answer.
Excellent. Predicting the correct answer, right? That's how I said it in the class, but framing your own answer. Absolutely, you're right. If you don't predict your own answer and start reading the answer choices, what happens is the answer choice messes up with your mindset. The answer is there to convince you to think in a specific way, which is the wrong way, right? That is why I have been saying to my students, never look at the answer choices. Have your own answer, and then as you do process of elimination, eliminate any answer choice that does not match with your answer, right? That's the safest way to approach the reading test. Did you do that on August 26th?
Yeah.
Good, and your score does tell me that it worked for you very well, right? Great. So, any closing remarks, Saksham? Many students of your age, not only in the UAE, but also around the world, are going to take the SAT test on October 7th. You're going to retake it on October 7th. Don't forget to register for the test tonight. But what advice do you have for them in terms of mindset? Let's not get into the details. What kind of mindset should you have as you enter the test center?
As you enter a test center, you should have like the mindset that this test is not really a big deal. It doesn't really matter. Because if you are thinking with that mindset, you're not really as pressured or as devastated if like you miss a question or two. You can skip a question, come back later, doesn't matter as much to you, and so you can do it with less pressure and more calmly, and this actually works better and will give you a better score, surprisingly enough.
Right. Entering the test center with a positive mindset is absolutely important. In my free time, when I do a practice test, I have this very arrogant attitude towards it. Before I even read the question out, in my head I say, of course I can do this. This is a piece of cake. And that kind of self-motivation does work magic in the test state. Saksham, College Board announced that there is no penalty for wrong answers on the digital SAT, just as there wasn't a penalty for wrong answers on the paper and pencil SAT. Do you agree that there is no
That's
penalty?
just a lie. That's not even true. If you get a question wrong in the first section, if multiple questions wrong in the first section, the second section will be way easier. Which you would think is good, but no, you just don't have the same opportunity to even get a higher score. If you flub it in the first section, you can't recover. Which is the problem with the SAT, digital SAT test. Mistakes in the second question aren't really penalized as much, but in the first section, if you mess it up, it really affects your score really badly.
Absolutely, and I experimented this on College Board tests. If you have a few mistakes in the first module of reading and writing, then the test engine judges you and thinks you're not a very brilliant test taker. Therefore, your second module is easier. And that's a bad thing. Why? Because the easier questions don't grant you those additional points that you could have bagged if you had a more difficult section, right? So the penalty for wrong answers on the digital SAT is not in a traditional sense. It's a more modern problem with modern solution kind of scenario. You will not get a negative score when you miss a question on the first module, but that dictates the level of difficulty of the second module, and the easier the second module is for you, the lower your score is going to be, right? And I think that's one of the things that makes digital SAT a more difficult test to score on. Not a more difficult test in terms of the questions you have, but a more difficult test to score on. Do you agree with me? Do you have any experience with the paper and pencil SAT?
I took a mock paper and pencil SAT. I didn't get a score because I didn't know how to calculate it.
Mm-hmm. But did you feel that that was a more difficult test to take compared to the...
No, because in a paper and pencil SAT, there may be more questions, but you have way more time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not, and if you flub one question, it's not like it affects the score as much as it does in the digital SAT. Because in a digital SAT, you can make like a silly mistake and you lose a lot of marking.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter as much in the paper and pencil SAT.
Absolutely, yes. There is, because we have so many questions on paper and pencil SAT, and I say we have because US students still take the paper and pencil SAT, right? I had actually a student from the US who goes to school in the US but was taking SAT preparation at UniHawk with me, and she took the paper and pencil SAT. Reading alone has 52 questions. Writing a language has 44 questions. If you add that up, that would be 96. Am I right? Is
Yes.
my math is right? Okay. So 96 questions, 800 points. Now, if you do a simple proportionality, that gives you a lot of room for error without so much cost. On the digital SAT, you have 50 questions that carry points. I know there are 54 questions in total, but 4 of those questions are experimental questions.
Yeah.
They don't count. So 50 questions, 800 points. Now, each question is worth almost twice as much as the paper and pencil SAT questions, right? So that's why there is very little room for error. And you better pray to God if you make a mistake at all, it's in the second module of reading and writing, second module of math. Because if it's in the first one, you're not only missing that question, you're telling the test engine to make it easier for me in the next module, right?
Yeah.
Great, great. Okay, now that SAT is a done deal for you, what's next?
I'm actually planning to take a course on game design for my university. I haven't really thought much about where to go other than US because they mostly have the best game design programs. I think it mostly matters what I do with it rather than where I do it. Game design has always been like a passion for me. You can look at like a very simple game like Ludo. You play it very often, not really much anymore. But even such a simple game with the rules so simple and a child could understand, left mostly up to luck, and then somehow it's fun.
Yeah, I remember back in the days, Call of Duty. I know that it has changed a lot nowadays, and I don't play the game anymore, but in late 2000, I think it was 2008 or 2007, we would go to cyber cafes. I don't know if you know what they are.
Yeah.
And all of these computers were networked locally with one another because simply nobody had that kind of internet those days. And we would play Call of Duty, and there was a loudspeaker in the basement, so people were shooting at each other in the game and, you know, throwing words at each other across the room. That was a lot of fun, a lot of shooting and a lot of violence. I don't know, for some reason, my younger version enjoyed that kind of chaos. What kind of games do you play, by the way?
I play all kinds of games, like party games, story-based games, roguelikes. You know what a roguelike is?
No.
Roguelike is a type of game where not much progress is carried over between attempts.
Okay.
It's like trying to beat all of Super Mario in one go rather than just starting the stage every time.
I see. Yeah, well, I can totally feel that I'm not relevant anymore to the game market, but it sure sounds like a lot of fun. So game design, what does that entail?
It's mostly about how one should design a game to make it appealing. Basically, how to make something fun. Game design, you would not think it has many practical applications outside of just making games. But if you know game design, you can practically make anything fun. You can make anything into a game, basically.
I kind of disagree with you on this one. A few years ago, a game went viral. I think it was called Among Us, right?
Yes.
And I saw people playing that, and I could not get the logic of that, and it bored me to death. So, do you think that was a fun game? Did you play that?
Yeah, I used to play it fairly often. I didn't play online much with real friends.
I see. And do you think the person who designed that game took a course in game design, or it was just, you know, let's do it, and then they just did it?
Yeah, basically, game design is different from game development because design is mostly about how to make the game fun, and development is mostly about how to actually make a game, like out of programming. I couldn't tell you if they took a case on game development, but I'm pretty sure they would have taken a case on game design because to design a game like that, it's quite hard if you haven't.
Stereotypically speaking, people of your academic strength want to study medicine, engineering, computer science, law. But you said you want to study game design.
Yes.
How does your family feel about that?
They don't have a problem with it. My dad was really encouraging. They actually, I feel like they want me to take game development or anything else because that's the thing that I enjoy. And if you can enjoy what you're doing, you don't work a day in your life.
That's absolutely right, yes. All right. Thank you very much. If you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, any other social media platform that you may have. See you next time.